Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're zooming in from today. Thank you for joining us for the afternoon portion of the 2023 meeting. My name is Alexandra Federico McGrath, and I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed speaker, Dr. Michal Kurlaender. Professor Kurlaender currently serves as the Chancellor's Leadership Professor at the University of California, Davis, where she has been a member of the faculty since 2004. Dr. Kurlaender's research investigates students' educational pathways and access to and success in higher education, focusing on the causes and consequences of the racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and gender inequalities, as well as the institutional policies and practices aimed at attenuating educational inequality. She was elected to the National Academy of Education in 2020 and was the recipient of the Higher Education Leadership Award by the California Educational Research Association in 2021. Thank you, Professor Kurlaender, for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for just for spending part of your Saturday with me. I appreciate it. I was saying to Kevin and Alex that I sign up for way more Zooms than I ever tend to actually go to, so I just appreciate it. And I've also migrated slowly to Google Slides, and so I'm optimistic this will all go well. So bear with me as I do that. And how does that seem? Good? Excellent. Okay. All right. So actually Kevin came up with the topic for my talk, so I appreciate it, Kevin. So I just realized that as I was writing it. So thank you, stuff I've been thinking about for a long, long time. We'll actually just do a quick presentation outline. I don't know if the culture of NAPC is to interrupt, but I'm definitely comfortable with folks interrupting for clarifying questions throughout. If not, I'll keep going and pause at the end, obviously, for some discussion and questions. So I'm going to talk about current considerations given the wake of the SCOTUS decision, and I'll talk about some important lessons from California, which, as folks may know, has actually been in this sort of post-affirmative action space for now several decades as a result of Proposition 209 in 1998, and then talk a little bit about what now. All right, so I guess first, just to sort of lay out the consequences of the decision, is that we expect that selective colleges and universities will likely become substantially less diverse. We also worry a lot that the reduced degree attainment of students from different racial ethnic groups, largely as a result of the sorting that might happen, this is what we saw in California, to less selective colleges that have lower completion rates. And of course, we're particularly worried about the harms towards racial equity in education more generally. So this is just kind of super broad focus, and I'll go much deeper into all of these. But I'm going to start by just anchoring us, and this is going to be one of the themes throughout my talk today, which was that affirmative action never did enough anyway. And so let me just first start with this, then I could show several, and I have a couple. This is actually from Richard Aram and Mitchell Stevens. I think the New York Times did the graphic for them, but it's from their opinion piece earlier, and that just shows how few Black and Latino students were attending selective colleges to begin with. So here you have the colleges along selectivity levels. To the left, colleges that admit less than 25% of applicants, all the way to the right, which is the majority of our institutions that are broad access. And in particular, you see where students from different racial ethnic groups attend, and in particular, that majority of Black and Latino students have attended, and white students have attended schools that are actually much less selective than the ones that are that get a lot of the media attention that we spend a lot of our time thinking about. So just a couple contextual pictures. This is one of my favorites. This is from Nick Hellman's work, and uses much more detailed level data from the Opportunity Insights data, and it shows sort of selectivity here are in these squares. And so this is selectivity and family income. And so if you look to the left, you'll see these are families from the top 0.1%, not even 1%, but 0.1%. And in particular, you can see that they're the only group across income that have a great number of their students attending highly selective and selective institutions. That is, children who come from families in the top of the income distribution are attending highly selective and selective colleges disproportionate relative to students whose family incomes are much lower. So most students, and in particular lower income students, are in this yellow broad access institution space. And so while we are going to still spend some time worrying about the end of affirmative action and its implications for selective admissions, we're going to also want to keep in mind that the majority of students, particularly low-income students and students of color, are attending less selective institutions. And so I will argue that actually our attention, and perhaps especially now more than ever, needs to attend to those. All right, so what are some lessons from California? Let me just sort of first, so again, California ended the use of race-based affirmative action or race-conscious policies in education in 1998 with the passage of Proposition 209. This is just a map to show you kind of just more broadly college attainment or college enrollment, I should say, in California. Our overall numbers, this is just right pre-pandemic, is about 63%. These just show our counties to show we still have many counties where the enrollment rates are much lower. This is also just for students coming straight out of public high school, where some counties have enrollment levels of 36%, others have high, where the shading is a little bit darker, like in the Bay Area and the greater kind of Los Angeles region, where enrollments are much higher at 75%, which is significantly higher than, say, the national averages. Also, just to show you, we're kind of a unique system in that, from our master plan from 1960, we have 9 sort of more selective University of California campuses, 23 campuses of the California State University, and 116 at this point community colleges. And so you can sort of see they're displayed across the state. Where do students, California students, go to college? And this is also just from data right up to the pandemic. So you can sort of see what makes California also unique is that nationally, about 70% of students who are enrolled in post-secondary institutions are enrolled at four-year institutions. In California, many of our students, and not just students coming straight out of high school, but also adult undergraduate students are attending our broad access two-year colleges. Some of them actually now also giving more than just associate's degrees. There's a push in California that I won't talk about as much, but that is the community colleges awarding baccalaureate. But I'm going to refer to them as two-year colleges. And you could see among California students from high school who go directly into college, over a third of our students enroll in community colleges. That's the yellow bars. Here's what that breakdown is by race. Just again, to show sort of overall, the gray is no college. And so 69% of California public high school students right up to the pandemic were enrolled in college. And that number is lower for socioeconomically disadvantaged students. That's the second bar that you could see. And we can also see important differences by race. Black and Latino students go to have higher no college enrollment rates. That's the gray bars. Also higher community college enrollment. And we can see in particular, the most selective campuses are the green bars, and that's UC. And you see really, really high rates, disproportionately high rates for Asian American students. In this graph, it's combined in some other graphs I'll show. I've disaggregated Asian subgroups. All right, too much on context. What I wanted to talk about is actually, so what has California done to address, let me just actually first back up and say what have been the impacts. You're seeing this a lot in the media. What can we learn from California's situation? So what we know from California is, I think I have it on my others. No, it's okay. What we know from California's end of use of affirmative action from now over nearly 30 years ago is that there was a huge drop in the representation of, in particular, Black, Latino, and Indigenous populations at the most selective UCs. And California does not have a percent plan like other campuses, or it has a weak percent plan. But one of the most important things that have happened in the last several decades is California's move to test blind admissions. And so that's actually, I'm going to spend a little time talking about that, because I think that's what is, sort of up ahead for what came about from the pandemic for many public institutions seems to be here to stay. So I just want to talk about that because took an active role with our University of California system to do this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about an analysis we did to look at different standardized assessments, including high school grades, to predict how students fare in college. And so this is work that was published and that's been ongoing as we have more and more cohorts that are under test blind admissions policies. And so in this work, we're going to ask several questions. We're going to compare how different inputs of achievement matter for who gets into the most selective UC campuses. And then we're going to look at the relationships between each of those inputs and outcomes by different racial ethnic groups. So to do this, we needed to match California high school students to enrollment at UC and CSU, and we're going to fit a series of regressions. And so let me just, I thought I had a slide that did this, but let me just sort of say, why are we doing this? So the University of California Regents took up the test blind option initially in the pandemic, but had been thinking about it for a while and was facing a lawsuit brought about to end the use of testing as a disproportionate impact, harming students of color. And so it was taking up this case, and then the pandemic hit, and we saw lots of images of students taking tests, on poor Wi-Fi and various parking lots, et cetera. And so there was a real momentum to kind of think about the ending the use of testing in admissions. So we were asked to basically do an analysis because we were sitting on our lab, sitting on data that could answer some really key questions on what would we lose, right? What would happen if we didn't use admissions? How well did testing predict how well students did in college? So what we're going to do is we're going to match these data of high school students to their post-secondary outcomes, and we're going to fit a series of regression. Incidentally, this is what the College Board does when it assesses like how valid our tests for different admissions. Basically, we're going to follow the same thing, and actually College Board collaborated to the extent that they gave us some important information about restricted range. What do I mean by restricted range? For a little bit of technical, not all students apply to college, right? And so and not all apply to the same colleges. And so when UC is looking at a set of applicants, it needs to consider that the pool of the applicants is not a random pool. It is a select pool, a restricted pool that's restricted on the host of characteristics of those who apply. And so it doesn't represent sort of the full distribution of SAT test scores, for example. And so the College Board gave us information to be able to adjust for this. So I'm going to, spare you a lot of the technical details, but just show you the punchline. What did we learn from this? So what we learned from this, and here you'll see, let me just orient you a bit to this table. Here we're going to try to predict first-year GPA. Now, do we think most of us are teaching at colleges and universities? Do we think first-year GPA is the end-all outcome? No, I don't think so. Not for me and not for most of us. It's not the end-all outcome, but it is the one that the College Board validates when we've been using SAT for so many years, right? It asks sort of what's an input that we could use to tell us how successful, in quotes, will students be in college. And so all of this sort of the weight of the SAT for so many decades has been hinged on the outcome of first year college GPA. So I just want to sort of say that out front, that it's not necessarily what we think of as the end all outcome, but it is the one that we use for measuring measuring the SAT. So what are we going to do here is we're going to compare not just the SAT. What was important about our analysis was that it looked not just at the SAT versus high school GPA, but also against the standardized assessments that California used. So California uses the Smarter Balance assessment, and we asked, given that all 11th grade students take this test anyway, taxpayers pay for it. It is a test that represents more of what students are supposed to be doing in their school. It's also got, it is not norm reference, it's criterion reference, has a bunch of properties. It also has some of the most accessibility in terms of accessibility for English learners and for students with disabilities. We sort of said, why do we use the SAT? Why wouldn't we use the Smarter Balance if we're going to use a test? Now, importantly, by the time we were presenting this analysis to you, we're also asking, why any test at all? Why not just high school GPA? And so that's the real point of this analysis, is sort of, we said, how do each of these inputs separately, high school GPA, separately SAT scores, separately Smarter Balance, and or their combination, how do they predict how well students do? So as you've been staring at this graph, and there are many other things in the model, the upshot, which is in the box in red, is they do about equally well. And the adjusted and the raw just means sort of on the subsample of UC applicants that we adjust given their unique characteristics because they apply to UC. And so what we can see is, if we look at the column 4 there, that the high school GPA does, once you control for the campus students apply to, for their socioeconomic status, for the high school quality, that's what HSCCI at the bottom means, the high school GPA does as well as on its own, as does the SAT and Smarter Balance. You might see a slight, you see that slight difference of 0.7 to 0.58 from the SAT, and we kind of argue that that's not very meaningful substantively, even if numerically it's slightly smaller. And then how an outcome we might actually care about, which is, do students persist in college? Do they stay beyond their first year GPA? We can see that all of these measures predict actually unwell, right? So equally unwell, if you will. So we have really poor predictions given all of those, given these key inputs that we have used in admissions for so long, test scores and high school GPA predict, do not do a very good job predicting who persists in college, which is an outcome I think most of us would argue matters a lot more than just the GPA in their first year of school. So here we see those similarities.
How, could I jump in with one quick question?
Please, please.
How much are those three independent, like HS, GPA, SAT, and SBAC, how much are those correlated with each other?
Highly correlated, especially the two test scores. And so it's a great question. They are highly correlated, and it actually is a myth on people, who want to use test scores. Many times they say, oh, well, there are these students who just don't, they don't get along with their teachers, or maybe they just don't do as well as grades in class, but they score really well on, and there is some of that. But in general, on average, these are highly correlated. And in particular, the two test scores, SAT and Smarter Balance, are highly correlated. And the reason you know that they're highly correlated is also notice that when we add them both in like those later rows, they offer very little additional predictability. So obviously if you use high school GPA and SAT, or high school GPA and Smarter Balance, our prediction of first year grades goes up. That's over here. I don't know if, can you see that my cursor is here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So they do go up. So they add additional predictive power to first year grades to some extent, but they're highly correlated. In particular, the two test scores are highly correlated.
Does the correlation vary if you're looking at socioeconomically disadvantaged students versus non-socio?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. In the interest of time, I didn't show. I'm not showing all those graphs, but to answer your question, all of these tests don't do as well predicting the outcomes of students of color as they do white and more advantaged students. So thanks for asking that. They don't. The patterns that we see here are the same across racial ethnic groups, but the levels are lower. That is, they're less correlated with these outcomes. We do a worse job predicting the outcomes of Black and Latinx students and lower income students than we do white and Asian students.
Thanks.
Okay, so why did I mainly want to talk about this is I had to do this setup, but the real reason we wanted to do this is to say, okay, so if we're going to predict how students fare once they get in college, and we use just one of these inputs or their combination, what happens to the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity, right? And so we're going to assess these distributional characteristics of the top. We're going to predict who would be at the top based on, say, first year GPA, if we use each of these respective inputs on their own and together to be able to sort of say what would be the implications of admissions if you only used one or more of these inputs. And we're going to do this by race and income. And so here's what it looks like by percent socioeconomic disadvantage. Keep in mind that socioeconomic disadvantage is a coarse as in it's not a very fine kind of grain input on income. So we're using sort of free and reduced price eligibility or parents' education here. We've done it in a variety of other ways. And so here what you see is the outcome here is that what's the percent of socioeconomic disadvantaged students that we would predict would be in the top 10% of the UC applicant pool if we use the gray bar to the left, only high school GPA, if we use only SAT, if we use only Smarter Balance, and then their combinations, the three columns to the right. And so what you can see is we get many, many more socioeconomically disadvantaged students if we just use high school GPA to predict. Again, an input that I just showed you, hopefully convincingly, does just as good at predicting first year GPA, but importantly, it picks up so many more as an input on its own, so many more lower income students than does the SAT or Smarter Balance, right? So, so you can see this really big impact on the number of low-income students that would be predicted to be in that top 10% of the UC applicant pool if we use just high school GPA. We do a little bit better with using the smarter balance than the SAT. Not a huge surprise given the properties of those two tests, which I could go into if we have time, but I probably won't. And then finally, here's what it looks like by race. And in particular, just draw your attention to the left bar, which shows high school GPA only, and the higher numbers of Latinx students. We do see higher numbers of Black African American students. That looks very, very small because of the overall representation of Black students in California as well. But importantly, it is an increase. That the green highlighted bar does show an increase there. And in particular, we see higher rates of Latinx and African American students that would be in that top 10% of the UC applicant pool if we just use high school GPA as opposed to the SAT and smarter balance, or their combination. Okay, so has this helped? We're several years in, totally confounded by the pandemic. Keep that in mind. So this happened literally as the pandemic hit, and that's very hard for us researchers to tease out. But has the move to test blind admissions helped? The short answer is yes. One of the first key pieces of evidence for that is that literally thousands of more applicants to the UC, in particular the most selective UC, repeatedly from number of surveys and qualitative studies, we saw many California high school students saying, finally, I feel like I might have a shot at that selective institution, and that they felt that they had been, sort of harmed by their potential use, by what they perceived as the harm of their SAT scores in particular. And so the short answer is yes, it's helped. Now, of course, there are other components of the application that also have racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic bias, and we're seeing that in studies coming out all the time. Don't assume that the college essay or extracurricular, other things don't have a host of biases in terms of college admissions. So can say more about that, but in particular, we also know that these additional applications don't necessarily translate to better admissions practices or to completion patterns. And that, I think, in recent work from the U.S. Department of Ed and others to sort of remind us that it's not just about admission, it's also, and I will show a slide of this around completion as well. All right, so in particular, I'm just going to sort of suggest back to this theme that I'm going to make, which is that affirmative action wasn't enough, and that is the persistent racial, ethnic, socioeconomic inequality in the pathway to college more generally, and that institutions that serve more students of color and more low-income students have fewer resources and have weaker degree completion outcomes. So why am I saying this? Because the majority of our, at least in California, and this is the case for the US as well, students of color and low-income students are not attending schools that have strong completion rates. I am actually going to skip some of these. This, just in the interest of time, this is the 6-year, because we're, Alex, how long do I have?
Another 5 minutes officially, but Kate said it's okay if we run over by about 10 minutes. So I would say about 2 minutes if that's
okay. All right. Well, this is the 6-year completion outcomes. And so in particular, again, this is the 2-year, this is 6 years from starting college. Here's our completion rates overall. We know, and then gender. So we see, if we look at just, if you want to focus your eyes on just the 4-year completion rates, that's the blue bars. And you can see female students are more likely to complete than male students. Students who start college more traditional age, that is right after high school, are more likely to complete within 6 years. And then we see these patterns. In particular, we note Latinx students and Black and African American students are showing lower completion rates, 6-year completion rates, than white or in particular Asian American students. The slides I skipped, I just want to show that I could show many of these. I could show it by math. I could show this is AP exam taken. And in California, where I do the majority of my work and work closely with the California Department of Ed, there's a very stubborn, persistent patterns of racial inequality and a whole host of the inputs in the pipeline to college that are really where we're trying to focus most of our attention. This is one of my most favorite ones. This is the distribution of California public high schools and the rate at which students complete the sequence necessary to even be eligible for 4-year colleges and universities. And so you can sort of see the average the average rates are about half, a little over 50% of high school seniors eligible for four-year colleges, but we see many of our California public high schools have much lower rates of students being eligible. This isn't even applying, this is just being eligible to enter a four-year college or university. So I'm going to argue that actually the majority of our work, beyond sort of helping selective admissions work within the new legal constraints, is actually to reduce the inequalities in the pipeline to begin with. Okay. Hi, Gary and Patricia. Nice to see you. What a nice that you just popped up on my screen. Okay, so what are some key strategies? All right, so I'm gonna, this conveniently came out in the last week and a half, I think, strategies for increasing diversity and opportunity in higher education. So I draw your attention to this really important report that came out, and they offer several important strategies. And I'm going to say a little bit about some of these in a minute. So the key ones are recruitment. So what do we do now with outreach and pathway programs, admissions? And so this is really the nuts and bolts, like now that you can use race, sort of what can be done. Financial aid. So we know that affordability remains just a really huge issue. In particular, like our debt issue, like sort of the big elephant of the debt, and how it disproportionately impacts students of color, but also reduced complexity in seeking aid is a big one, and then completion and climate. So the first thing I want to say is that there's really importance, and there's lawyers, I think, in the room, at least, maybe only Kevin, but maybe others, right? So the first is just to caution to not overreach in interpretation of the ruling. And so this is just from even the Department of Justice Q&A sheet, right? That universities may continue to embrace appropriate considerations through holistic application review processes. California's been doing holistic review for a very long time, and most, now all of the UCs. But for example, to provide opportunities to assess how applicants' individual backgrounds and attributes, including those related to their race, experience of racial discrimination, or the racial composition of their neighborhoods and schools, position them to contribute to campus in unique ways. And so there's a lot of documents coming out, a lot of conversation around how to still talk about how students can still talk about their lived experiences, adversity, the extent to which the conditions of their school, home, neighborhood environments have impacted sort of who they are today, and how that could advance, sort of be important to the kind of college community that they're applying to. So, all right, so what's my sort of very map forward or path forward, right? So the first is to continue to push on eliminating admissions practices that advantage already advantaged groups and negatively impact diversity. We're seeing lots of pressure for more and more colleges, for example, to end legacy preferences. I think we'll continue to see that. Again, just to remind you to those first graphs I showed you, while extremely important, this will not have the big impacts on low-income students and students of color, the majority of whom are not attending these selective colleges to begin with. So I just want to make sure we kind of appropriately scale the excitement around this, which I have as well, around the ending of legacy preferences. Similarly, is early admissions applications. And so we know many colleges admit over 30% of their applicants through early admission, which is sort of affirmative action for more affluent families that can sort of commit early, but without sort of looking at the financial aid packages, for example, that different colleges would offer students who can't afford to apply early. And then finally, these blind test optional policies. My understanding from College Board and others is that most institutions are staying where they are, and that is at some are moving back to the use and requirement of the SAT, but most are staying optional, if not blind. And students are in general quite supportive of these policies. I already mentioned the further consideration of students' individual circumstances, and I think here's where that black box of holistic review is going to keep kind of being pushed, to sort of think of the ways in which those individual circumstances intersect with race. We already know from a variety of work that race-neutral policies don't do as good of a job as actually consideration of race, but to the extent that some combination of individual circumstances, neighborhoods, contexts, et cetera, may make a difference. And then finally, we also know that in our most selective institutions, including public flagships, there's a much smaller proportion of the overall public high schools represented, right? And so there's this great need to increase outreach to students from underrepresented high schools, that is, high schools that aren't sending students to college and high enough and as high of rates, but also to not to selective colleges. California has had a very weak, I mentioned this early in my talk, a weak percent plan. That is, it doesn't guarantee admissions to a particular UC. And we do have some, not all of our UCs are as impacted. And so it hasn't had the weight that, for example, Texas's percent plan has had, but I expect we may see more of this. Already some conversations around in Wisconsin and other public flagship selective institutions. But I'm going to argue, as I started and as I've said throughout, that the real need, that this is really a call to address the persistent barriers to opportunities that are through the education life course, if we are to address kind of broader inequalities in college completion. Let's see if I think, okay, do I have time to go into some of these, or should I stop here, Alex?
I just texted Kate, and so she said until 12:10 would be fine.
Okay, so that's okay. All right, so what does that look like? So I'm not just going to say we need to do this. I'm going to actually suggest a couple ways in which we could do that. And so the biggest is sort of to ease the complexity of degree attainment. What do I mean? I mean, there's many off-ramps, too few on-ramps. We're seeing some of this. And so where I'm again in a state with a pretty involved post-secondary system that, and those systems often don't speak to each other in a very coherent way, leaving the onus on students to figure out when to transfer, which courses count towards which degrees, how to seek aid. Some colleges do a very good job in securing aid to students. Other students report really late disbursements. There's a whole host of ways in which students get sort of pushed out given institutional constraints. I already mentioned affordability. I'm going to argue simplifying processes for satisfying degree requirements. Our kind of canonical case is the California community college student who wants to transfer and has different requirements depending on the campus they would apply to, depending on the major they would go to, they would be interested in. And even sometimes across the community college system, a course that might be counted in towards a degree in one campus may not be. So we have really greatly harmed our students by not figuring out institutional practices that leaving the onus on students instead of on institutions to figure this out. So for us, at least in our state, but many others, the complexity of degree attainment for today's student who looks very different than the student of half a century ago. They're much more likely to be working while enrolled. They're much more likely to attend multiple institutions, to pause their enrollment for any number of reasons. And so that's the path that I think we need to sort of continue to improve. All right, so so one of the ways to do that is to kind of reinvest in public investment. So individual students have had to bear the cost of increasing tuition and of increasing sort of supports. And so I think again today, I think that I had a chance to work on some of the recovery efforts in California from the pandemic, and what I've noticed there, along with kind of our what we're seeing coming from the federal government, is that there's a kind of opportunity in this urgency with these Supreme Court decisions, but also in recovery efforts to actually address some of the core needs that students have, both in terms of affordability, but also in terms of we've demonstrated that colleges can be adaptable, right? The pandemic has shown everyone that there is a way to meet students' needs amidst great disruption. And so I argue that we need to sort of stay the course in terms of ensuring that kind of flexibility, agility, whatever term you want to use, that institutions have exercised in the midst of the pandemic. Some of that needs to stay because we've learned a lot from that experience in a way that has met more of students' needs, and we need to do more of that. Again, whether it's through financial aid reform and debt cancellation, but also through easing some of the institutional barriers that have continued to limit opportunities. I think we've had great examples of how that's happened, including kind of ending developmental ed that didn't work for students, and many other examples. And so I think I will stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great. Well, we're all supposed to return to the main room now, where we'll be put into breakout rooms. And I think we have 2 separate groups. So I just put the link in the chat. And once we get over there, Kate will send us to where we are supposed to go. So I will see some of it. Thank you.
This is the part where you all help us think about basically where we go from here in terms of NEPC commissioning a brief or doing some other work in this realm. So just think about what we're going to do in the smaller groups is think about what Michal is talking about and how to sort of contribute to the public discourse around these issues, and yeah, that sort of thing. So thank you. That's the big work that we then take from this meeting and move forward with. But yeah, let me add my thanks again, Michal, and we'll see you all in the main room and then in the breakout rooms.